It's like Vegas, no classes.
Nope, never in a classroom, which I'm like, I mean, I didn't wear a watch before I worked here.
Welcome, everybody. Thank you all for joining the Western Center for Social Impact and Innovation for this year's first Western College Legacy Seminar. Speaker, who is Camille Winbish. I'm Jackie Doherty, and I direct the Western Center, which is Miami's interdisciplinary hub for student engagement with social justice and impact issues. In honor of the organizers from the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee and the volunteers they trained 60 years ago, this year in June, at the Western College for Women, right across Patterson Avenue on Western Campus, we will bring scholars and practitioners to discuss the greatest threats to our democracy today, approaches to resist those threats, and ways to strengthen our systems. Freedom Summer's goal was to ensure that Black voters had access to the ballot that Jim Crow denied. And today, many of our state legislatures are again considering and sometimes enacting bills that chip away at voter access and rights. We are so excited to bring Camille Winbish, the inaugural Director of Campaigns and Field Programs with the Lawyers Committee for Civil Rights Under the Law, who has spent over 10 years protecting our electoral processes from voter suppression and other threats. Before this, she served as the Election Administration Director for Ohio Voice, where she organized statewide election protection efforts and collaborated with organizations on programs that strengthen our democracy, including the Ohio Voter Rights Coalition and the Ohio Fair Courts Alliance. And before that, her aunt Sybil Harris Miller and uncle Bill Miller were Miami University students who traveled to the South to support Black voter registration efforts in 1964 and subsequently dedicated their lives to struggles for justice. Lastly, we invite you to visit the League of Women Voters of Oxford and the Wilkes Institute tables in the back to register to vote and to support anti-gerrymandering efforts through petition signature. We'll likely have time for questions at the end of tonight, so hang on to them as Camille goes through her talk. And without further ado, I'm going to hand this off to you, Camille.
Okay. Can you guys hear me? Does my mic sound okay? Okay. A little more. Okay. All right. How's this? All right. Well, thank you to Dr. Doherty for inviting me to speak with you today. It's an honor to be here to commemorate and reflect on the lessons of the 60th anniversary chapters of the Freedom Summer. I'm just really grateful to be here today because it's especially wonderful to talk to students, because the students and the young folks were the ones who are really leading the movement for civil rights and for voting rights. And so those are the folks who are going to carry us forward and to actually get us the democracy that we deserve. Special shout out to my parents, Ron and Yvonne Miller, for being here and supporting me, and for my Aunt Sybil and Uncle Phil for always supporting my career. We have several generations of family who are from Oxford, and so this has always felt like home. So I'm going to start by taking us through a little bit of history. I thought we would start off with Reconstruction. This is a period in time of kind of a high watermark for Black civic participation, at least for men. And it's often sort of ignored or glossed over in history. But in Reconstruction, so after the Civil War, there was the 15th Amendment that was ratified. And that 15th Amendment finally said, okay, we cannot deny people the right to vote based on their color, their race, or their previous condition of servitude. That, of course, left out women. They're going to have to wait their time. But for Black men, they really did take advantage of this newfound right, and they were voting in high numbers. They were also able to elect a really strong contingent of Black representatives to send to Congress and to statewide offices. So there were 22 Black congressional delegates that were sent to DC, as well as 2 Black US senators in the 1878. Unfortunately, this period of high civic participation and political representation was very short-lived, because in 1876, federal troops moved out of the South, and in their wake was left Jim Crow, essentially reinforcing white supremacy back in the South. And so we had issues with Black men being able to vote. And essentially they had mob violence reinforcing those laws. By 1910, every Black man who had been on the rolls and was able to vote was disenfranchised by Jim Crow. Okay, so from Reconstruction to the Voting Rights Act of 1965, it was roughly 100 years. And during those 100 years in the Confederacy, there were numerous and significant burdens and barriers to the right to vote. That took the form of many things, like poll taxes. So the state saying you have to pay a specific sum of money in order to be able to vote. It looked like literacy tests, which folks may have heard, where not only do you have to prove that you can read and write, but you may actually be asked to memorize portions of the state constitution. You may have to interpret what those clauses mean in the Constitution. And all of this was subject to the whim and discretion of all white clerks to decide whether or not these Black men and Black women were able to pass these tests. So the literacy rates, of course, there was a large gap in literacy between Blacks and whites. In 1910, they said about 50% of Black men were literate versus, I believe, something like 10% actually, there was only 10% of whites were illiterate. And so to compensate for that gap, they enacted grandfather clauses. So they said, if your grandfather had been able to vote before the Civil War, by gosh, never mind about those poll taxes and never mind about the literacy test, you get an automatic pass. But so that meant, given the legacies of slavery, where it was illegal for Black people to be able to read and write, that meant that Black people were left behind and not able to take advantage of the franchise. There were also other arbitrary practices that were in place. You may have heard of things like how many bubbles in a bar of soap. There's some magic number there that entitles you to the right to vote. How many jelly beans in a jar? Oftentimes clerks would say, okay, great, you want to register to vote? Come on down. We're open one day a month. That's when the offices are open. If you come down that one day a month, the clerks could just ignore the Black people who came. Sorry, we're just not able to see you. I had actually really hadn't heard about all white primaries, but in states like Texas and I think Louisiana, they actually had a political process where they said, okay, these primaries are only for white people. We're explicitly saying only white people are allowed to vote and to have a voice in picking who is going to go on and be elected. If for some reason you got through all of these hurdles in all of these states and you managed to get on the rolls, there are still big consequences coming your way. You could be threatened with losing your job. And in the Confederacy, there was a social hierarchy and economic disparities, so that meant that Black people were beholden to whites for their jobs. And if they didn't want you voting, well, they're going to take away your job and your livelihood and your ability to support your family. So that had a major deterrent factor. Jail time was a real thing. They could throw you in jail if they found out you had the audacity to try to register to vote. They could make up any charge they wanted to and throw you in jail. And when all else failed, they could just use intimidation tactics, lynching, etc. This article right here is pointing to an election in Texas. They ran in the paper. They wanted everyone to know that the KKK is going to be available at polling locations in Texas to just make sure all of the voting procedures are being followed. So it wasn't a subtle hint, okay? So given everything that was at stake, there's no wonder why places like Wrightsville, Georgia, no Negroes just wanted to come out and vote that day. All right, so Fannie Lou Hamer is an amazing icon, and she was one of the organizers of Freedom Summer, who was here on the campus of Western College. And she sort of detailed for a primetime audience what her experience was like trying to register to vote in Mississippi. Fannie Lou Hamer was a sharecropper. She attempted to register to vote. She went with a group of 17 other Black individuals from her county. When they got to the courthouse, there were armed guards circling them. She said she tried to do her best anyway. She was undeterred. She tried to fill out that form very carefully. And when she finished, they all got back on the bus to drive back to their town. And they were pulled over by the police, who said they were driving a bus that was the wrong color. The bus was too yellow. Apparently that's a crime, and they were fined. All right, so that sounds crazy and unbelievable, but it happened. So remember when I said about trumped up charges? So she gets back to her home. The plantation, basically a plantation owner who was responsible for her livelihood, found out that she had been trying to go register to vote. And he said, "You need to take yourself off the rolls. You can't stay here." And she said, "I'm not going to do that." So within that day, she was evicted. Her family was evicted from her farm. And then, so they relocate the family. They pick a house. A couple days later, the house is shot up with 16 bullets, all because she attempted to register to vote. And still, she was undeterred. And this picture here is when she came to the DNC. She had a primetime audience with the DNC with a national platform. And she was telling those national audiences what it's really like in Mississippi, because one of the reasons why Freedom Summer was happening was because we really needed to shed a spotlight on what was happening in Mississippi. The voter registration rates were so low, the lowest in the country. And so she really captured people's hearts and minds. She was actually such a threat that the president hastily got together a press conference to take her off the air so that no one would see her speech. But it backfired because the news kept replaying it, that the president was so intimidated by listening to what she had to say. So she said, "Is this America? The land of the free and the home of the brave, where we have to sleep with our telephones off the hooks because our lives are threatened daily because we want to live as decent human beings in America." All right, so the Fannie Lou Hamer speech and primetime audience was one major catalyst that got the Voting Rights Act passed. This, of course, was another amazing catalyst. This was Bloody Sunday, March 7th, 1965. John Lewis, Hosea Williams, Martin Luther King, those folks were marching to try to bring forth attention for voting rights from Selma to Montgomery. And even though they were peaceful marchers, they were met immediately with billy clubs and tear gas. This was carried on a primetime audience. They carried that, and so given that a lot of folks in the North didn't even realize that this was happening in the South, that this was the brutal reality, it really shook our national conscience, and it put the political pressure that was necessary on President Johnson to do something and to take action. And so from that day forward, they announced their plans to craft one of the toughest voting protections that this country has ever created. I'm going to get this arrow things right. All right, so Bloody Sunday, Camille Winbish, all of the hundreds and thousands of volunteers and marchers and protesters finally made their points heard. And so we decided, we as a country are going to actually demand that we live up to what's in the Constitution, 100 years that has been blatantly ignored, denied in the South. And so the Voting Rights Act, what was unique about it was that it took an approach to say, we're going to be proactive here. We're going to look at the states in the South that have a history of discriminating against Black people, and we're going to make one of the major provisions of the act is we're going to say they're going to have to get pre-clearance or permission in order to, before they pass any voting laws that could be discriminatory against people of color. So they would have to get permission from the Department of Justice and the or the DC court. There were 9 states, almost all of them were in the Deep South, that had to get this pre-clearance. The criteria was they had literacy tests that they had in place. So again, can you tell us what this constitutional provision means? And they also had registration rates that were 50% or below of the Black population was registered to vote. If you could check both to those boxes, you had to get pre-clearance from there on out. It was extremely effective. It blocked all of this bad voting laws and ideas and practices before they went into effect. All right, so this graph shows the impact of the Voting Rights Act on registration rates. So the first one is registration before the Voting Rights Act. The orange bars represent Black voters, and the white bars are white voters. You can see in the next graph over there, after the Voter Registration Act went into effect, the orange bars shoot way up. And you can also see Mississippi, clearly, as I mentioned, the lowest voter registration rate. They only had 6% of their Black population was registered to vote before the Voting Rights Act of 1965. A year after it passed, it went up to 60%. It's not that Black people didn't want to register, they didn't want to be engaged. They were willfully, intentionally left out of the process. This graph shows, this kind of brings into context what we were talking about in terms of registration and participation, starting from Reconstruction, and the high water mark for Black male participation. So this first starts with Louisiana. You can see that the darker line is Blacks in Louisiana. They were actually had a higher registration rate than white people in Louisiana in the Reconstruction period. And then, as I mentioned, Jim Crow marches its way in, it gets embedded, they change their state constitutions that say you have to do these poll taxes and literacy tests and all these other things, all white primaries to deny Black people their franchise. Then voter registration rates bottom out. Jim Crow, very effective. Then we pick up over here towards when the Voting Rights Act goes into effect. And there's an immediate infusion of registration, both in Louisiana, and this darker line over here is a compilation of all the Confederate states. You can see as we move over to the 70s, 80s, the registration gaps between the races it narrows a lot. And then I've got a little dot over here, right around 2008, and the lines actually flip. So Black voter registration is higher than white voter registration for the first time since Reconstruction. Does anybody want to guess what happened in 2008 that might change something?
Shelby versus Holden.
Okay, that's one guess. Okay, go ahead.
2008 election had candidates Barack Obama and
Yeah, it's the Barack Obama effect.
so
Black people turned out to elect the first Black president. Oh yes, so this graph is, the first one I was just talking to was registration. It's great to be registered. That means you're able to participate. This is actually marking turnout in the modern era. And so again, you see Black turnout low, 15%-ish in the 50s. Voting Rights Act, 1965, turnout goes above 60%. The gap narrows. We get to 1992, Black turnout actually higher than white turnout. 1992, anybody? Bill Clinton. Then it dips again, and it's higher, 2008 and 2012. So this is a new political reality, and that reality absolutely shaped our policies and our perception of what voting rights can be and should be. All right, so Congress reauthorized the Voting Rights Act many times. The Voting Rights Act, the pre-clearance part was really temporary. It had to be reauthorized in order for states to continue to fall under pre-clearance in the Confederacy. There were 5 times the Voting Rights Act was reauthorized: 1970, 1975, 82, 92, and as recently as 2006. What was remarkable about the 2006 reauthorization was that the US Senate actually passed it on a bipartisan basis. Not only was it bipartisan, but it was 98-0. When was the last time you could remember the Senate agreeing to do anything 98-0? Let alone thinking voting rights, understanding that voting rights was something that was good for all Americans. A lot of that had to do with, John Lewis being in the Senate and being able to be an amazing ambassador for what it meant for the blood that he shed in Selma, what it meant for voting rights, what it meant for the Senate, what it means for all Americans. But unfortunately, the political winds had changed. And by 2013, you mentioned Shelby, 2013 was the Shelby decision. The US Supreme Court decided, hey, we saw those statistics. We saw Black registration rates are up. We saw Black turnout is up. We don't have discrimination anymore. We have a Black president. We don't need the Voting Rights Act. So they struck it down. They struck down the key provision of the Voting Rights Act that required states with a history and pattern demonstrated discrimination against Black people and other people of color. They just eviscerated it. And they said, the formula just doesn't work now. It's not modern. We just don't need it anymore. And so in response, many states went ahead and immediately started passing voting restrictions. Today, the core tenet of the Voting Rights Act that we're really left with is Section 2, which of course continues to say you can't discriminate against people on the basis of race when it comes to voting. The problem is we have to wait. Before with pre-clearance, you could just say, we hear this law, we already know on the face it's bad. Now we have to wait for each individual state to go ahead, implement the law, watch it discriminate against people, watch the disparate impact, and then litigate it on a case-by-case basis. That can take years. And also, the court now takes a very dim view of the need for voting rights. So essentially, after Shelby, the floodgates opened, and state after state passed restrictive voting legislation immediately. Texas, the very same day the decision was announced, went forward with their strict photo ID bill. It had been on hold because of pre-clearance, and with the US Supreme Court's permission, there was nothing to stop them from putting it into effect. North Carolina, same deal. They passed a monster voter suppression package within 2 months of the decision. Mississippi, Alabama, other states also followed the same course. This graph shows the trend of voter ID, strict photo ID, right? So that is a law that basically says you can only vote if you have one very specific form of identification, often a driver's license. If you had a utility bill, maybe you don't drive at all, you have a utility bill that can prove who you are, that's not good enough. Some states used to have practices where they just had to have like a neighbor at the polling location vouch that that's their neighbor and sign their name on the poll book. Suddenly, that's not good enough anymore. Universities, they used to be able to say, this is a student who is enrolled, here's a letter, here's their university transcript. States have said that's not good enough. Some of these states have moved toward a very strict formula that says you can only have one type of ID, and we know that already says other populations of color are less likely to have those forms of ID. So right after the Shelby decision, the states that previously were pre-cleared, they went gangbusters for strict photo ID. The states that weren't under pre-clearance, they're gradually showing more interest in voter ID, but it's not drastic in the same way that this is a clear concerted strategy by states that had pre-clearance to use strict photo ID as a way of keeping voters, people of color in particular, out of the voting system. All right, so that brings us to our current state of affairs and current barriers. We could be here all night talking about all the various forms of restrictive voting barriers that exist today. Of course, we have ID laws, which we just sort of touched on. We talked about limits on early voting. Many states have, especially after COVID, have realized it's really a good practice to give folks an opportunity to be able to cast their ballot more than just on election day, but to spread that period out so that there's not a huge rush on the polls and our systems are better able to handle the volume of voters, as well as giving them options if they're not able to physically come to a polling location. And yet those limits are being rolled back in many states. Voter purges have become a common practice if voters are not voting frequently enough. That means they get placed on a list where they no longer receive election notifications. They may not even realize they've been purged until it's too late when they go to try to vote and they find out they're not on the rolls. It could have been a mistake. The rolls, mistakes are commonplace. And there's no procedure to get them back on the rolls in time for their vote to count. Myth and disinformation is a big threat. I'll spend a lot of time the remainder of tonight talking about that. There's a lack of voter education, just in terms of states not funding elections and giving people the correct information so they know how, when, and where to vote. Voter apathy is a real thing. People have felt disenfranchised by gerrymandering. Shout out to the league and the folks with their petitions in the back. They're feeling disenchanted by our political elected officials who don't represent their values. They don't feel they have to be accountable to the folks who put them in office because they're running in very safe elections that have been artificially manipulated to give them an advantage, no matter how extreme their positions are. And then, of course, we're facing issues with rising intimidation and violence at the polls. Going back to the KKK example in the paper, where there are folks who are feeling like they can be vigilantes out there looking for fraud, out there threatening people who don't think they should be able to vote. It's an unfortunate commonplace that we're dealing with now. And then we all witnessed January 6th, and election sabotage and interference are very real threats that face us because there are actors who do not care about the democratic processes and just want raw power. In terms of election legislation, it's kind of a mixed bag for 2023. The states on the right represent states that have passed expansive voter legislation, pro-voter policies to make it easier for folks to be able to vote, expanding early voting, expanding the list of acceptable IDs. The states on the left are states who have doubled down and passed laws that make it harder for folks to vote. Ohio is not, it should be on the restrictive blue because we just passed a major voter suppression bill. They just got it under the wire in 2022. So yeah, so there's kind of a mixed bag, but folks that live in, say, California or Oregon or Washington or Nevada are having policies that are catering to them, to their convenience, to their needs, and voters in places like Florida and Texas, unfortunately, are having fewer choices and having more chances that their ballots actually won't count. Mis and disinformation is on the rise, and as a starting point, misinformation is mistaken information. M for mistake and M for misinformation is how I remember it. Disinformation are deliberate attempts to deceive. There's the D's there. Misinformation, disinformation, those are not new. We had disinformation, you know, back 10 years ago, it would be like, oh, there's a flyer going around the neighborhood that says Democrats vote on Monday and Republicans vote on Tuesday. What's different is that we have social media now. And so somebody can post something that's incorrect and literally millions of folks can see it and not be aware that it's actually not truthful. There are bad actors who are online looking to spread disinformation for a variety of reasons. It could be political, financial, ideological. They're really just trying to see that their viewpoints hit the mainstream. And they're relying on reporters, they're relying on trusted messengers, they're relying on folks like you who may see it and they go, oh my gosh, can you believe this? This is so awful. You may write something on it, you may give like an angry face, but by doing that, by commenting, by sharing, you're amplifying the disinformation. So it's really important that if you see something that's not factual, that you report it, we flag it, we take it down, we don't share it because we're just feeding into what they're trying to do. Disinformation is really bad for our democracy. It erodes trust in our elections because people think all of a sudden our elections are rigged. We can't trust the people who are elected to office. Then people, as we see, have a motivation to either not vote, tell other people that the system is rigged, or take things into their own hands and commit violence in the name of doing the right thing. There's also an increase in the level of threats to election officials. Election officials are just getting barraged with threats online, physical threats in our offices. It's making them not want to come to work. And when people decide that they're going to resign, they take with them their knowledge, their institutional experience, and then that leads to more problems and mistakes that happen in elections. The more problems and mistakes that happen, the more people say, see, these elections are rigged. They're not working out the way they should. Then less people want to vote or trust that the elections are fair. So it's very cyclical. And so the other thing that happens is it also justifies and validates why we need voter restrictions. There's so much fraud in the vote by mail system, so we've got to roll that back. It's a self-fulfilling prophecy. I'll give you two quick examples of some of the disinformation that's happened relatively recently. This first one was a Black robocall that actually my organization has been part of the litigation to try to correct. But there was a Black robocall, a robocall that targeted Black residents in Philadelphia, Cleveland, Chicago, Detroit. And they sent a recorded message to Black, because you can use public data and figure out target Black audiences, Black neighborhoods. Sent a message and said, hey, you know, if you vote by mail, your personal information is going to be part of a public database that's going to be used by police to track down you for old warrants. It's going to be used by credit card companies to collect debts. It's even going to be used by the CDC to get you to take a mandatory vaccine. So just don't vote by mail, okay? Clearly, it's going after all these old tropes and trying to elicit fear-based reactions. This other robocall that happened just recently in January was targeted in New Hampshire. And it's a sign of the new times of using artificial intelligence to really deceive voters. And so there was a recorded message that sounded just like Joe Biden, who told you, what a bunch of malarkey, you should just stay home. Don't vote in this primary. It's not for Democratic voters. You're just going to be giving Donald Trump an edge. So we've got to be on the lookout for more of these types of examples where folks are trying to use artificial intelligence, what they call deep fakes, to trick and deceive voters either to vote one way or to stay home. Many false claims about our elections are sort of impugning the safety and security of our elections. Most folks don't really have a solid understanding of all of the protocols that go into place to keep our elections safe, whether it's having bipartisan election teams, whether it's creating ballot design issues so that ballots can't easily be replicated and tampered with. And also vote by mail has been used in many, many states for decades without an issue. But all of a sudden, given this rise of disinformation, now vote by mail is a place that's fraudulent. Also in 2020, given COVID, when folks didn't feel well or unsafe to go into polling places to vote, many, many states decided to make voting by mail more accessible to voters. And unfortunately, given all of the rhetoric around the unsafe qualities or fraudulent aspects of vote by mail, many states have fallen into this disinformation loop and decided to roll back vote by mail for their residents. There's no evidence that there was any issue with vote by mail. Dropboxes, has anybody used a Dropbox before? Yep, they're pretty cool, especially if you live close to one, because as we know, the mail gets slower and slower. And it's your ballot. You want to know that it's secure, that it got where it needed to go. And so Dropboxes have been a popular improvement to our voting accessibility. 32 states had Dropboxes in the 2020 election. 1 in 5 ballots were returned in Dropboxes. They've got, they're monitored with cameras often. They've got, fireproof. There's been surveys of all the election officials, red states, blue states. No one reported any issue with Dropboxes and no fraud or theft that impacted the election. And yet, after the 2020 election, 5 states moved to ban Dropboxes. 6 moved to limit their availability. North Carolina had a disinformation campaign that was so successful that said there was this Dropbox fraud that was implicating all the ballots in North Carolina. Oh my gosh, what are we going to do about this fraud in these Dropboxes? North Carolina doesn't even have Dropboxes. But people believed it. This is the map where you can see Dropboxes. The dark green states are states that have broad access to Dropboxes, particularly in the western states that started all voting by mail elections. They've got Dropboxes in libraries and community centers, looking for places for people who conveniently can drop off their ballots and securely know their ballots get back in time. The states in the south, orange, banned, no Dropboxes. No Dropboxes for you. The states in light green, we have Ohio, we allow Dropboxes, but they're limited. 1 Dropbox per county. If you're up here in Oxford, what does it take, 30 minutes to get down to Middletown and drop off your ballot? Disinformation is hurting election administration. 64% have said that false information has made election official their jobs more complicated and dangerous. 1/3 of election officials said they've been harassed or abused or threatened. More than half think it's going to be more difficult to recruit poll workers and election workers in future elections. Remember the brain drain I was talking about? If you don't have experienced people who understand the mechanics of running an election, then you've got newbies who don't know what they're doing, who are bound to make mistakes. which is giving rise to people's loss of confidence in our elections. More than half of the election officials in swing states are expected to be new for this 2024 election. This is an example of some of the threats that are happening in Arizona. Arizona became like a ground zero of Dropbox conspiracy theories. There were armed vigilantes, the new KKK, who thought they should camp out at Dropboxes 24 hours, recording people with their tactical gear, taking pictures, videotaping them, writing down their license plate numbers, threatening to report them to election police, because they had the audacity of trying to return their ballots in a Dropbox. 80% of women, of election officials turn out to be women. And according to Pew, the most hostile, extreme threats online are being targeted towards women. So it is concerning when we think about our election officials. And there are also issues with packages arriving in election official offices that have been suspicious. More than a dozen states have said, yeah, that happens a lot. So now security is on their minds, right? How do we keep our election officials safe? And unfortunately, they are investing in things like Narcan, because they're getting packages with fentanyl sent to them. They're having bulletproof glass installed to interact with voters. Some election officials in Colorado are even wearing bulletproof vests to come to work. They're just trying to do their job. They're just trying to make democracy work. And this is how America is responding. All right, so here's my quick wrap-up spiel. Don't want to leave you feeling like there's nothing we can do. It's all doom and gloom. We have a resource that's available to voters to help navigate these challenges. And it's 866-OUR-VOTE. It's our election protection hotline. It's a nonpartisan resource that's available year-round to help voters who have questions or problems voting. We have legal staff available to provide assistance. We can work with election officials to get to the root of a problem. If necessary, we'll file litigation on behalf of voters to make sure that there are no systemic problems that keep people from voting. Oftentimes, people just need basic voter education. They need to know where their polling place is. They need to check their registration. They're not sure where they should go vote. They got this thing in the mail. They don't know if it's legitimate or not. So having trusted messengers to be able to give them clear and concise information about how to actually make their vote count is what's really valuable. There's a variety of hotlines, different languages that are supported: Spanish, Arabic, Asian languages. The thing about the hotline is we need people to share it and promote it so that people know that this is available to them if they have questions or problems. And so we encourage you to share it and use our social media toolkit at 866OurVote.org to let people know about this hotline. The hotline also includes, it works in coordination with field programs. We have volunteers who are active in all of these dark green states, 34 states in 2020. We had 40,000 volunteers nationwide working to protect people's votes and make sure that they have the resources they need at polling locations. So there is a place for you to plug in. As a poll monitor, you can work and speak to voters outside of polling locations, help them with their common issues. You get a quick training about how to be a resource, how to direct people to the right information. And yes, many great experiences. Just providing that one-on-one support makes voters feel really grateful, lets people know that we have their back, and that if they were to encounter any intimidation, threats, just feeling like a poll worker said something or did something that was inappropriate, they've got an advocate with them, either on the phone or in person, to navigate those problem spots. And last but not least, we really need folks to work the polls. As I said, it's getting harder and harder to work the polls. Election officials are losing people. They need folks who are dedicated, who are conscientious, who really care about our elections, and who are there for the right reasons to make sure folks can vote. So if you have the time, I imagine the university may give like the day off on election day. If you have time to, being a poll worker is a really great experience and important for democracy. I think that is all she wrote. Questions?
If you do have a question, if you could stand and speak up.
Yeah, I guess I can stand. Hey, could you say something more about that Supreme Court decision 2013? I don't know a great deal about that, but I'd be fascinated to know what the rationale was for ending that voter rights. Thanks.
Yes, of course. So that decision was Shelby versus Holder, and it was a decision. The opinion of the court was carried by John Roberts, who said essentially the voting registration rates of people of color has risen. The registration gaps have closed. We don't have the same. We don't have literacy tests anymore. We don't have poll taxes. So the same rationale that we had back in 1965 when we passed the Voting Rights Act doesn't seem to apply. If you want to show, if Congress wants to demonstrate that there is a problem, they're going to have to figure out a new test to keep states under preclearance. A lot of the states in the South, as you might imagine, felt like they were having to they're being shamed, right? Like, oh, you did this terrible thing to Black people, like, when are you going to let us move on from that? That was 60 years ago. There were other opinions who said, well, the reason that these gaps have closed is because we have these protections. The Voting Rights Act is what has allowed our democracy to come up to the level where it should be, where both races, all races, are able to participate equally. If we take away those protections, then it's like saying, well, I'm not getting wet because I have an umbrella. Of course you're not going to get wet. What happens when you take the umbrella away? That's what we're seeing now. We took the umbrella away, and the states have free reign to pass laws that have a discriminatory impact, if not intent, against people of color.
I have a question. One of the slideshows that you had that had some of the states that were had inclusive voter rights, and then the states that had restricted voter rights.
Mm-hmm.
Some of the states, if I remember correctly, were both built in.
Yeah.
Could you give an example of how that makes sense?
Let me try to find it.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I mean, there may be examples where a state might say, okay, we're willing to pass online voter registration. The time has come in Texas where we agree we should have online voter registration. 85% of the other states have online voter registration. We have found also that there's no partisan like gain from having online voter registration. Both Democrats and Republicans enjoy registering online. So a state may decide, okay, fine, this is so common and widespread, we're okay to do this. But at the same time, they may have bought into there's fraud in vote by mail. So therefore, we're not going to allow 2 weeks for early voting. Some states have decided, oh, there's souls to the polls, and you may have heard of that, where traditionally Black churches will organize their congregations to go as a community and vote on Sundays. A lot of states have said, oh, guess what? We don't need Sunday voting anymore. So in that case, they would have a proactive expansion, but also a restriction.
One question online was best tactics to combat racial gerrymandering.
Best tactics to combat racial gerrymandering. Well, I mean, of course, independent redistricting commissions, right? What we found is that partisan actors will, when they're given the power to draw maps, to determine who gets the seats, who holds the pen to decide who holds the seats in the state legislatures, partisan actors will almost invariably use the pen to benefit their political party. Having independent citizens who don't have those same political pressures to use sort of neutral redistricting criteria, things like keeping communities together, looking for ways to maximize competitiveness, so that you don't have a situation where the indexes are so far off that it's impossible for any Democrat to win or impossible for a Republican to win, because we've manipulated the lines so much that we're dicing and slicing communities for the sake of partisan gain. So one way would, of course, to have independent commissions. Another way is having elected officials, being accountable to those folks. So, using our voices to voice our displeasure about that. And then we have courts. Our federal courts are being filled by whoever is in power in the presidency. They decide hundreds, if not thousands, of judicial nominations. Those federal nominations are for life. And so we can decide we don't like one political candidate maybe and just sit home for this election, but the person who holds the presidency has power over courts for decades. And if we have partisan judges who are not in favor of following the Constitution and favor of their political parties, unfortunately, we will have judges who won't uphold the Constitution and will keep racial gerrymanders alive.
Ohio passed this House Bill 458, which was their restrictive voting. And I certainly see how it targets communities of color, people who may live within the city, not have a driver's license, and younger voters who might be moving.
And older voters who don't have a license anymore.
Well, that's what I thought.
Or older folks in the South who it's very common that they might not have a birth certificate to be able to prove that they can get that license.
Yeah, I felt like older rural voters were also terribly hurt by this, who may be voting for, not mentioning any special party, the one that's pushing. We all know that the Ohio House is, dominated by one party.
Yeah.
I felt like they were hurting their own voters, perhaps in an attempt. I don't know. I realize that they're caught up in this flow of these repressive voting acts, but it felt to me like they were hurting their own voters. And handicapped voters, voters with some sort of a disability, if they've limited who could turn in their ballot. It has to be a family member. And they're being sued now, apparently, about that. But
you're right. You're absolutely right. There are policies that can actually hurt the political party that's voting against them. So, like voting by mail is a great example. Older voters rely on vote by mail. Military voters rely on vote by mail. And so if we make it harder for folks to be able to vote by mail, including those populations that tend to skew towards that political party, we're shooting ourselves in the foot. Like, we need to be looking, of course, we want to look at it from a vantage point of like what helps all voters, but unfortunately the political rhetoric is so loud that it can get in the way of good policy.
Question two. So in 2021, the House passed the John Lewis Voting Rights Act, and obviously it failed in the Senate, and there's motions to reintroduce the Voting Rights Act. My question for you is, how would this act supplement or add to the 1965 Voting Rights Act, and what things would it be for our country with voting rights?
Yes. So the John Lewis Voting Rights Act and the Freedom to Vote Act are things that they talk about sort of needing tandem protection. The Freedom to Vote Act would create a national standard so that all states had a set number of early voting days. All states had automatic voter registration. All states had online voter registration. So there was a baseline standard so that all voters were equally protected under our election rules. And then the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act is an attempt to try to modernize the pre-clearance requirements. So before it was based on, did the state have a literacy test? Did the state have registration rates that were below 50%. So some things that could be in consideration for the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act would be like, has the state made changes that have had a discriminatory impact on a certain population? Have these states moved to sort of at-large voting districts that are designed to prohibit Black and other communities of color from having a representative for them? Are there other changes that they have made that can show that the jurisdiction has been looking for ways to manipulate the rules to benefit one party or one race over the other? Until we have a bipartisan Congress, they're going to stall.
All right. Did you want to say something? So you talked briefly, well, not really briefly, about like the rise of dis and misinformation, especially in the face of like increased social media use, and now with the increased technology in regards to like deepfakes and all of that sort of thing. How would you suggest, if you have any suggestions for combating that in the best way possible to make sure that voters and younger voters aren't being restricted by this misinformation?
Yeah, that's a good question. I know that this is a topic that is taking up a lot of space for the social media companies. I know there are the Department of Justice and the Attorney General are taking a keener eye at what can we do to try to rein in some of this disinformation that's been allowed to fester. And so we're just going to have to kind of let that work its way through the system. But the thing that we can control is when we see it. So we can engage folks around disinformation campaigns. Social media monitoring is part of the election protection program that you can, if you want to look for disinformation, checking your own channels. We also can be promoting proactive, positive messages about voting so that there's more of the voter education that people need. And then the last part is like taking it down, reporting it, flagging it, not sharing it so that our circles aren't spreading it. So those are kind of the three things that are on the horizon.
One last question.
Okay, sure.
Could it be argued that we have a covert poll tax in that, for example, a license, if you don't have a driver's license, you've got to get a way to get in, you've got to take the test, you've got to pay for that. It seems to me that's a poll tax.
Yeah.
Covert.
Yes.
And that's only one example. I mean, if there are others, can that be argued legally that is a poll tax in essence?
Well, so there are many people who agree. I agree that those are significant monetary burdens that have been demonstrated to be more difficult for Black people and other people of color to be able to reach. Our current configuration of court is not inclined to believe that. And so they have let these states and their strict photo ID rules pass muster. So until and unless we change the configuration of our court, this is the trend that we're seeing.
All right. Thank you so much, Camille. I'm going to give another round of applause. Joining us tonight. As mentioned before, the Western Center will host another speaker on the topic of democracy and transformation, Dr. Craig Calhoun from Arizona State University, by way of the London School of Economics, also author of Degenerations of Democracy, will join us to talk about kind of global trends in authoritarianism that are growing on March 5th at 6 p.m. in Scheidler 152. That'll be another Western College Legacy Seminar speaker. Quickly, I also wanted to thank the Western Center coordinator, Billy Sims, who did an excellent job of organizing this event, as well as our student workers, Jade and Chloe. Thank you all for dealing with sign-in tonight. Thank you to Wilkes and to the League of Women Voters again. And thank you so much for everybody tonight. We appreciate this. More conversations like this need to happen.